Hello there. Today I would like to talk about splint armor. First, a brief introduction. Splint armor consists of a number of metal strips that are riveted or sewn to a foundational garment, generally made of leather. It predates plate armor and has often been described as a poor man's plate, the reason being that it's almost, but not quite as effective as proper plate armor. Its only advantage is that it's much easier to manufacture small strips of metal than it is to manufacture large plates of metal. To make a piece of sheet metal suitable to be forged into, say, a greave, you either have to start with a very large lump of metal and work it down into a broad sheet, or else forge weld a number of smaller strips together. The first is very time-consuming and frustrating, as thicker pieces of metal are exponentially better at resisting your hammer blows. And as the piece spreads out, it becomes more and more difficult to heat up evenly and to handle correctly. The forge welding process is much less time-consuming. However, forge welding is tricky under the best of times, much more so when you don't have much material to work with. Splint armor was a good compromise to cut down on unnecessary labor and risk of failure. Additionally, it lends itself very well to being made from smaller pieces of metal, such as from standard currency bars or even from recycled scrap. For example, I could turn something like this gate into a piece of splint armor relatively easily. It would be a nightmare to try and turn this into a piece of plate armor. There's a great deal of contention among history enthusiasts about how common splint armor was, what periods it was used in, and to some extent whether or not it was even used at all. There aren't very many surviving examples. All we know for certain is that some people used it to some extent at some point between about 500 BC and 1500 AD. I think it was used a lot more than the archaeological record would suggest, but all I have to support that idea is speculation. My reasoning is as follows. Firstly, strapping a piece of metal onto you so that someone can't cut you is a fairly simple idea. Simpler than making cloth out of metal rings, anyway. Secondly, it's relatively quick to manufacture in terms of man-hours, especially when you compare it to other sorts of armor like chainmail. I did a quick experiment where I forged a splint out of a piece of 3/4 of an inch square stock. It took about 10 minutes of hammer work. If I'm making a greave with 5 splints, that's less than an hour to do all the metal work. The usual counter-argument is that if it was at all common, why hasn't more of it survived? Now, setting aside the fact that something surviving for more than 1,000 years is a minor miracle, let's look at one of these splints again. Does this look like armor to you? To me, it just looks like a piece of metal with a couple of holes in it. I think it's likely that there's at least one surviving example that's simply been misidentified. But that's not the best argument, so I'll give another one. A strip of metal with a couple of holes in it is a really convenient shape for recycling. I can think of dozens of uses for a piece like this, and because it's so crude, I wouldn't feel any remorse about wrecking it. Even someone with no metalworking experience and with minimal tools can recycle something like that pretty easily, say into a bracket or a hook. There, 1-minute coat hook. All I needed was a single pair of pliers. That was quite the tangent. Let's get back on target. There are a number of potential variations in design. Sometimes the plates were on the inside of the backing, sometimes they were on the outside. Sometimes they were riveted, other times they were sewn. Sometimes they were backed with leather, sometimes they were backed with cloth. Sometimes the backing was just a row of belts. In terms of performance, it's almost completely immune to cuts. Points can only get through if they strike one of the gaps, and depending on the construction it might range from good to excellent against blunt force. I made this pair back when I was 17, so they're not terribly well researched or well made, but they work well. Some of the sewing was frayed, so I took it apart to show you the inside. First there's a thin leather liner to make things comfortable, then a piece of scrap wool to act as padding. Underneath the wool we have the splints, each riveted in place. The padding is there to cushion any blows, but more importantly they're to stop the rivets from chafing against my legs. The splints are all doubled up. This is just because the only scrap metal I had when I was making them was very thin. Something I want to talk about is why you might have the splints on the inside rather than on the outside. The common explanation for this is for weatherproofing, but as you can see here, these are quite rusty. The actual reason is that with them on the inside, the leather shell can hold them tightly together. If I fold it the other way around, notice how the splints become loose, and the greave overall becomes much more flexible. This isn't an issue of the gaps. You could overcome that by overlapping the pieces. The issue is of flexibility. Because the splints are no longer pressed tightly against each other and held taut by the leather, the greave no longer provides the same hard, shell-like defense. A blow striking, for example, the front splint would cause the greave to buckle inwards. Whereas with the leather on the outside, the greave has almost no flexibility. The greave cannot collapse any further inwards without tearing the leather. A rigid, shell-like defense such as this is very good at distributing blunt force. Another reason you might want the leather on the outside is to prevent a point from glancing off. A point that glances off will find its way towards the nearest gap, regardless of how small that gap might be. If, however, the point strikes something much softer than itself, chances are it won't glance off unless at a very steep angle. But having the leather on the outside also has its drawbacks. A point not glancing off means that you're going to get the full brunt of the impact every time. The softer material being on the outside means that it's going to get cut up as it gets used. And the splints being protected from the weather also means that you have to take the whole thing apart to clean them. Well, that's pretty much all that I have to say. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.